You walk through the narrow alleys of Murano as evening settles over the lagoon, the sky fading from a pale grey to a deeper shade that hovers between blue and charcoal, and the canal water beside the path lies so still that it looks like polished slate. The buildings on either side are old and worn, their plaster walls showing patches of brick where the surface has flaked away over many decades. And the wooden shutters on the upper windows are already closed for the night because the people who live here keep early hours. Your footsteps make a soft scraping sound on the uneven stones, a quiet rhythm that mingles with the distant lapping of water against the canal steps and the occasional creak of a moored boat shifting with some unseen current. The air is the coolness that comes after sunset in the late autumn, a damp coolness that carries the faint tang of salt from the sea, and the more immediate scent of wet stone and old iron from the bridge you passed a few moments ago. You know this route by heart, because you have walked it many times before, turning left at the small shrine with the weathered wooden Madonna, then right past the bakery that is shuttered and silent now, its ovens cold until the morning, then straight along the canal until the alley widens just enough to reveal the low door of the glassworks. The glassworks building appears as a dark silhouette against the evening sky, its roof a gentle slope of terracotta tiles that have been blackened in patches by the soot that drifts upward from the furnace chimney day after day, year after year. No light escapes from the front windows because those windows are small and set high in the wall, meant to let in daylight rather than to show what happens inside after dark, and the shutters there are drawn tight as they always are during the night shift. The only sign that the furnace is still alive is a faint orange glow that spills from a crack near the bottom of the heavy wooden door. A glow so subtle that you might miss it if you did not know to look for it. You pause for a moment at the edge of the alley to let your eyes adjust to the dimness, and then you move toward the door with a steady pace, your body already beginning to feel the pull of the work that lies ahead. The wooden door stands slightly ajar, and when you push it open, the heat washes over you in a slow wave, a dry and enveloping warmth that seems to push back against the cool evening air and settle around your shoulders like a heavy blanket. Inside, the workshop is almost entirely dark except for the light that comes from the furnace, a single bright circle of orange that glows at the far end of the room where the glory hole opens in the side of the brick structure. The rest of the space is lost in shadow, the shapes of workbenches and tool racks and the great bellows themselves only partly visible as darker forms against the walls. But you know where everything is because you have spent so many hours in this room that your feet find the way without your eyes needing to guide them. The furnace itself is a large cube of brick that stands in the center of the workspace, built to hold the heat of an intense fire that never goes out, never truly dies but only banks down to a quieter state between shifts. The glory hole is a circular opening in the front face of the furnace, about the size of a serving platter, and through that opening you can see the liquid glass inside, shimmering with a soft amber radiance that seems almost alive. The glow shifts slowly, a gentle ebb and flow of brightness that responds to the air currents in the room and to the fuel that smolders deep within the firebox below, a fuel made of carefully dried alder wood, and sometimes bundles of broom that the fuel merchant delivers by barge. As you stand just inside the doorway, letting your body grow accustomed to the heat, you can hear the low murmur of the furnace, a constant sound that is part hiss and part hum, the sound of a fire breathing steadily in its brick chamber, while the glass within it remains at a temperature that would turn any other substance into vapor. The bricks around the glory hole glow a dull red when the fire is running high, but now, early in the night shift before you have begun to work the bellows, they are a softer shade, more like the embers of a dying cook fire, a deep brick color with only the faintest hint of rose at their inner edges. You hang your damp cloak on a wooden peg, driven into the wall near the door, a peg worn smooth by the daily handling of fabric, and you step out of your outdoor shoes and into the soft leather slippers that you keep beneath the workbench for this purpose. The slippers are thin-soled and allow your feet to feel the texture of the floor, which is made of packed earth mixed with crushed brick dust, a surface that has been tamped down over countless nights of pacing and standing and hauling until it is hard and smooth as stone. The smell inside the workshop is complex and familiar. There is the sharp mineral scent of hot silica from the glass, the dusty odor of old ash that has settled into every crevice, and the faint sweetness of olive oil that the master uses to lubricate the wooden blocks and paddles. Beneath all of these is the deeper, more fundamental smell of the fire itself. A smell of carbon and heat and the slow consumption of wood. A smell that clings to your clothes and your hair and lingers on your skin even after you have washed. You take a long breath, letting the air fill your lungs, and then you move toward the bellows. The bellows are a pair of large leather chambers set in a wooden frame that stands to the left of the furnace, connected to the firebox by an iron pipe called a tire that passes through the brick wall and delivers a stream of air directly to the burning fuel. Each chamber is shaped like a wide, flat triangle, with wooden boards on the top and bottom and flexible leather gussets around the sides that allow the boards to move up and down like the wings of a slow bird. A long handle extends from the top board, and you grasp this handle now with both hands, feeling the wood worn to a polish where many other hands have held it before yours. Hands that belong to servants who worked this same shift in years past, some of whose names you know from the marks they left scratched into the wall near the water bucket. The leather of the bellows is old but well cared for, rubbed regularly with neat's foot oil to keep it supple and prevent it from cracking under the repeated stress of expansion and collapse. And as you lift the handle for the first time tonight, you hear the familiar creak of the wood and the soft rustle of the leather as it unfolds. The work of the servant is simple. You raise the handle, drawing air into the bellows chamber through a one-way clack valve that opens on the upstroke, and then you press the handle down again, forcing that air through the tuyere and into the furnace, where it feeds the fire and causes the temperature inside the crucible to rise just enough to keep the glass in its molten state. The motion is steady and deliberate, a full cycle of arms and shoulders and back that takes about 4 seconds to complete, and you have done it so many times that your body has memorized the sequence completely, leaving your mind free to wander wherever it wishes while the work continues. There is a small weight attached to the bottom board of the bellows to help the leather return to its open position after each downwards press, a simple stone tied with a leather thong, and you can feel that weight pulling gently against your hands as you lift the handle again, a constant and predictable resistance that becomes part of the rhythm of the night. The first few pulls of the bellows produce a change in the sound of the furnace, a subtle deepening of the hum as the extra air reaches the fire and the flames leap a little higher inside their brick enclosure, and you watch the glory hole as its color shifts from a quiet sunset orange to a brighter, more concentrated tone, a shade that reminds you of ripe apricots warmed by the afternoon sun. You settle into the rhythm with a kind of patient contentment, your feet planted shoulder-width apart on the earthen floor, your knees slightly bent, your weight rocking from your heels to the balls of your feet with each push and pull of the bellows handle. Your gaze rests on the glory hole, on that circle of shifting light that seems to expand and contract with each breath of air you send into the furnace, a slow pulse that is almost hypnotic to watch. The light from the opening throws a warm glow across the floor directly in front of the furnace, a long rectangle of orange that stretches toward where you stand and paints the toes of your slippers with a faint amber tint. Beyond that rectangle, the shadows gather in the corners of the room, deep and still, but there is nothing frightening about them because you know every inch of this space, every beam and rafter and clay pot, every tool hanging from its hook on the wall. The bellows handle moves smoothly up and down, and the sound it makes is a soft whoosh on the downstroke, and a quieter inhaling sound on the upstroke, a repeated pattern that quickly becomes as constant as the ticking of a clock. The leather gussets on the sides of the bellows bell outward slightly when you press down, and then they relax inward again when you raise the handle, a gentle flexing motion that you have seen so often that your mind no longer registers it as something separate from the act of breathing itself. As you work, you become aware of the other small sounds that fill the workshop. There is the occasional tick of cooling metal, some tool left too close to the furnace that now contracts incrementally as it gives up its heat to the surrounding air. There is the soft scrape of a mouse in the rafters, a creature that lives on the spilled crumbs of the workers' meals and that knows to stay away from the fire. There is the distant splash of an oar in the canal outside, a boatman moving in the darkness beyond the thick walls, his lantern a tiny point of light that you might glimpse through the high window if you turned your head. But you do not turn your head because your eyes are fixed on the glory hole, and the slow dance of light within it. The furnace has a way of capturing your attention completely, drawing you into its warm circle of influence until the world outside the workshop seems very far away, as if the island of Murano and the lagoon and the city across the water had all faded into a distant dream that has nothing to do with the simple reality of the fire and the glass and the bellows. After a while, you notice that the heat from the furnace has begun to build in your clothing, working its way into the fibers of your linen tunic until the fabric feels warm against your skin. The front of your body, the side that faces the glory hole, is noticeably warmer than your back, creating a pleasant contrast that shifts slightly every time you rock forward to push the bellows handle down. A fine sheen of moisture has formed on your forehead and your upper lip. Not the heavy sweat of hard labor, but a light perspiration that the dry air of the workshop quickly carries away, leaving your skin feeling cool and clean each time you pause for a moment between strokes of the bellows. Those pauses are brief and rare because the fire demands a constant supply of air to maintain the temperature that keeps the glass workable, and so you keep the rhythm going. One stroke after another, one breath of air for the furnace after another, and the minutes begin to slip away into the quiet darkness of the night. You do not count the minutes because there is no clock in the workshop, only the changing depth of the shadows and the slow exhaustion of the fuel in the firebox to mark the passing of the hours. But you have learned to feel the passage of time in your body, in the growing heaviness of your arms, and the slight stiffness that creeps into your lower back as the night wears on. For now, though, those sensations are still far in the future, and you are filled only with the calm steadiness of the work as it begins. The handle of the bellows rests in your grip, with a familiarity that goes beyond thought, the wood worn to a satin smoothness in the places where thumbs and fingers have pressed over countless nights. You wrap your hands around it now, the left hand near the end, where a slight curve gives you palm something to anchor against, the right hand closer to the center, where the wood is a little darker from the oils of skin. A brief pause follows while you adjust your stance on the packed dirt floor, settling your heels into the shallow depressions that your own weight has made over months of standing in this exact spot. Then you lean back, straightening your elbows, and the bellows begin to open. The upstroke comes first, the raising of the handle that lifts the top board and allows the leather gussets to expand outward. Air rushes into the chamber through the clack valve, a tiny wooden flap that rises silently on its leather hinge to let the outside atmosphere pour in, and the sound it makes is a soft, papery whisper, like the turning of a page in a large book. The leather sides of the bellows creak as they stretch, a sound that is not loud but deep, a low groan of material that has done this same movement many thousands of times and will do it many thousands more. You feel the resistance of the weight tied to the bottom board, a smooth downward pull that your arms counter with a steady upward effort, and your shoulders roll back slightly as your chest opens to the warm air of the workshop. Then comes the downstroke, the pressing of the handle toward the floor, and this is the moment when the real work happens. The clack valve closes with a tiny click that you feel more than you hear, a small vibration transmitted through the wooden frame, and the air trapped inside the chamber has nowhere to go except through the iron tire. You push steadily, using the weight of your body as much as the strength of your arms, leaning forward from the waist and letting your shoulders come with you. The air leaves the bellows in a smooth stream that you can hear as a low whoosh passing through the pipe, a sound like wind moving through a narrow alley, and that stream of air enters the furnace at the base of the fire and does its quiet work. The fire, which had been burning with a slow, sleepy orange glow, receives this gift of oxygen and brightens immediately. The flames inside the firebox leaping higher, consuming the wood more rapidly, sending a surge of heat upward into the crucible where the glass sits in its liquid state. The glory hole, that round window into the heart of the furnace, responds to your effort with a visible change. The color inside the opening deepens from the quiet amber that you have been watching to a richer, more luminous shade, a color that begins at the center as a bright peach and then softens toward the rim into something closer to the flesh of a ripe melon. The light pulses once, a quick expansion of brightness that corresponds to the arrival of the fresh air, and then it settles back to a steady glow that is just slightly more intense than it was before your pull. This pulse, this small flicker of increased radiance, is the furnace's way of acknowledging the work of the bellows, and you have come to think of it as a kind of conversation between yourself and the fire, a wordless exchange of effort and response that continues throughout the night. You lift the handle again, beginning the next cycle, and this time the motion feels even more natural, because your muscles have remembered what is required of them. The upstroke is a moment of relative ease, a gathering of potential energy that will be released on the downstroke, and your body moves through it with the smoothness of water flowing over a low weir. The leather creaks, the valve whispers, your shoulders lift and then settle as you complete the raise and prepare to push down again. Your breathing has already begun to synchronize with the bellows, an automatic adjustment that happens without your willing it, so that you exhale on the downstroke when you are exerting force, and inhale on the upstroke when the handle rises almost by itself with the help of the counterweight. This pattern feels as natural as the tide moving in and out of the lagoon, a rhythm that could continue forever without tiring you because it is so perfectly matched to the capabilities of the human body. The downstroke comes again, and again the whoosh of air travels through the tire, and again the fire responds with a brightening that travels outward from the heart of the furnace to the rim of the glory hole, and then fades slightly as you begin the next upstroke. The light in the workshop is never completely steady, because each breath of the bellows creates a small wave of brightness that ripples through the space, casting shifting shadows on the walls and making the tools on the rack seem to move slightly even though they are hanging perfectly still. Your own shadow stretches out behind you on the earthen floor, a long dark shape that wavers at its edges whenever the fire surges, and the shadow of the bellows frame does the same. A larger and more angular presence that seems to be a separate creature living on the wall. None of these shadows are frightening. They are simply part of the environment, as familiar as the smell of hot brick and the gentle pressure of warmth against your face. Speaking of warmth, you notice now how the heat from the furnace has begun to gather in the air directly in front of your body. The skin of your cheeks and forehead feels a steady, radiant warmth that is different from the heat of a summer day, because it comes from one direction only and has a dryness to it that pulls the moisture from your skin in a pleasant way. The warmth is not yet intense because the night is still young and the fire has not been stoked to its highest temperature, but it is enough to make you aware of the boundary between the hot zone near the furnace and the cooler air that lurks behind you near the workshop door. Every time you rock forward to push the handle down, your face moves a few inches closer to the glory hole, and the heat increases by a small but noticeable degree, pressing against your skin like a hand laid gently on the cheek, as you sometimes imagine it. Then when you rock back to lift the handle, the heat lessens slightly, and this small fluctuation becomes another layer of the rhythm, a thermal tide that matches the movement of your body and the breathing of the bellows. Your hands on the wooden handle have begun to feel the warmth as well. Not because the handle itself is hot, but because the air around it is warm, and because your own effort has brought blood to the surface of your skin. The wood remains cool enough to be comfortable, its temperature steady and reassuring, a solid point of contact in a world that is otherwise made of shifting light and pulsing warmth. You shift your grip slightly, moving your left hand outward by an inch to find a spot where the wood is fractionally thicker, and this small adjustment relieves a tiny pressure that had been building on the web of your thumb without your conscious awareness. The body has its own wisdom, you have learned, and it will tell you what it needs if you listen carefully enough to its quiet signals. The sound of the bellows continues, a steady background noise that has become so constant that you almost stop hearing it, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat after a while. The whoosh and the creak, the whoosh and the creak, blend together into a continuous low murmur that fills the workshop and spills out into the night through the high window and the cracks around the door. If a person were to stand outside in the alley, they would hear this sound as a distant hum, a peaceful industrial drone that signals the presence of the glassworks and the continuation of the ancient craft within its walls. The people of Murano are so accustomed to this sound that they sleep through it without trouble, and in fact many of them find it difficult to sleep when the furnaces are cold during the rare holidays, missing the familiar background noise as a sailor misses the rocking of the boat. Between one stroke and the next, you allow your eyes to wander away from the glory hole for a moment, and to take in the details of the furnace wall that surrounds it. The bricks are a dark red in the places where the fire has not touched them directly, but around the opening they are a paler shade, almost pink, where years of intense heat have calcined the surface and changed the very structure of the clay. Tiny cracks run through these bricks in a web so fine that it looks like the crazing on an old ceramic cup. And you know that each of those cracks tells a story about a night when the fire was especially hot, or a morning when the furnace was allowed to cool too quickly. The mortar between the bricks is crumbling in a few spots, little gaps where the lime has turned to powder and fallen away. And sometime soon, the master will call the furnace builder to come and make repairs, packing fresh mortar into the gaps and replacing any bricks that have become too fragile. But for now the furnace holds, as it has held for many years, and the heat stays where it belongs, inside the firebox and the crucible chamber, warming the glass and not escaping into the workshop, except in the controlled way that the glory hole allows. You return your gaze to the opening and continue the steady work of the bellows. The cycle has repeated itself now so many times that you have lost count, which is normal and expected, because counting would require a part of your mind to stay alert and active, and one of the pleasures of this work is the way it allows the mind to disengage and drift. Your body knows what to do. Your arms rise and fall, your weight shifts forward and back, your breath matches the rhythm, and all of this happens with as little conscious direction as the rising and falling of your chest while you sleep. The conscious part of you, the part that worries and plans and remembers, has retreated to a quiet corner somewhere behind your eyes, and from there it watches the glow of the furnace with a kind of peaceful detachment, asking nothing, expecting nothing, content simply to observe the slow dance of light and shadow in the warm, dark room. The minutes accumulate into the first quarter hour of the shift, though you have no way of measuring this precisely. You know only that the fire is burning well now, that the bellows are working smoothly, and that the temperature inside the crucible is climbing toward the point where the master will arrive and begin the evening's work of shaping the glass. The glass itself, that pool of molten silica and flux and stabilizer, sits in its ceramic pot inside the furnace, waiting with the patience of a substance that has no need for hurry. It has been liquid since the previous shift, when the day workers fed the furnace and brought the fire to full heat, and it will remain liquid until the furnace is allowed to cool for its annual maintenance. In that sense, the glass is always ready, always waiting, a constant presence in the life of the workshop, as permanent as the bricks and the tools and the bellows themselves. You think about the glass sometimes during these early hours of the shift, imagining what it looks like inside the crucible, a pool of heavy, slow-moving liquid that glows with its own internal light. The surface of the glass is perfectly smooth because it has been undisturbed for hours, a flat plane of pure orange that reflects the roof of the furnace chamber above it. Beneath that surface, the glass moves in slow convection currents, rising near the center where the heat is most intense and sinking near the walls where it cools just enough to become slightly denser. A circulation that takes hours to complete a single loop. Bubbles of gas, released from the raw materials as they melted together, rise through the liquid at intervals and burst silently at the surface, leaving behind a tiny ring that quickly smooths itself away. You have seen the glass, of course, every time you look through the glory hole, but you have never seen it directly with your own eyes because the opening is angled, and the crucible sits deep within the furnace, and so you can only glimpse the topmost surface, a bright disk of liquid light that seems to hover just out of reach. The bellows handle continues to move under your hands, up and down, and you feel the first faint signs of the labor in your muscles. A gentle warmth in your shoulders and the top of your back that is not pain, but simply awareness, the body's way of noting that it is being used. This feeling is pleasant in its own way, a reminder that you are alive and strong and capable of doing the work that has been given to you. You shift your weight again, moving your right foot back by a thumb's width to improve your stability, and the small adjustment makes the motion of the bellows feel even more efficient, as though you have found a mechanical advantage that was hidden inside your own stance. The sole of your leather slipper slides easily on the packed earth, which is smooth and polished by the daily movement of feet, and you anchor yourself once more in the new position and continue. The high window, the narrow slit that looks out onto the canal, shows nothing but darkness now, a black rectangle that contrasts with the warm orange walls of the workshop. Through that window, very faintly, you can sometimes hear the sounds of the night outside, the splash of a fish jumping, the distant bark of a dog on some other island, the church bell from San Pietro Martir, marking the hour with a deep bronze tone that carries across the water. The bell has not rung for a while, or perhaps it has rung and you did not notice, so absorbed were you in the rhythm of the work. It does not matter either way because the bell is not your concern. Your concern is the fire and the glass and the steady supply of air that flows from the bellows through the tire and into the heart of the furnace. Another wave of brightening passes through the glory hole as you complete a particularly strong downstroke, a stroke that carries a little more force than the ones before it, because you were momentarily distracted and compensated by pushing harder. The light swells up and paints the ceiling beams with a brief wash of gold, revealing the grain of the old wood and the tiny cobwebs that hang in the corners, and then the light subsides again and the beams retreat into shadow. You note this without interest, simply observing the fact as you might observe a cloud passing across the sun, and then you return your attention to the handle and the next upstroke. The leather creaks, the air rushes in, your shoulders roll back, and the cycle continues without interruption, a loop that has no beginning and no end, only an endless middle that stretches out into the darkness of the night. The glory hole is a circle cut into the brick face of the furnace, a perfect round opening that has been worn smooth at its edges by decades of tools passing in and out and by the patient erosion of superheated air. Its diameter is just wide enough that a man could push both fists through side by side, though no one would ever do such a thing because the interior temperature is high enough to turn leather into ash in a heartbeat. You stand at the bellows some 8 feet away from this opening, and from your position you can see the whole disk of it, a bright coin set into the dark wall of the furnace that draws your eyes toward it again and again, no matter how many times you have already looked. The color inside the glory hole is not a single flat shade, but a living gradient that shifts from one moment to the next, a quality of light that depends on the fuel in the firebox, the strength of the air coming through the touré, and the stage of the night's work. Early in the shift, before the master has begun to gather glass, the glow rests at a soft, steady amber, the color of clarified honey held up against a candle flame. At the very center of the opening, where the heat concentrates most intensely, this amber lightens into a pale lemon yellow, a bright core that seems to hover above the surface of the molten glass, rather than to emerge from any single point within it. Around the rim of the opening, the glow deepens to something closer to a pumpkin's flesh, a rich and muted orange that bleeds into the dull red of the surrounding brick without a visible boundary. The whole effect is of a small sun captured and held inside a clay chamber, a sun that never sets and never moves, but only breathes in place. When you pull the bellows handle down and send a fresh stream of air into the fire, the glory hole responds with a subtle brightening that travels from the center outward, a ripple of increased radiance that takes perhaps a second to cross the whole disk. The central pale spot flares up first, growing whiter and more intense before the wave reaches the middle zone of amber and finally fades at the rim where the orange deepens for a moment and then settles back. Watching this ripple is like watching a stone dropped into a pool of colored water, except that the ripple moves in reverse, starting at the center and spreading to the edges rather than the other way around. The whole phenomenon lasts only as long as the extra oxygen is burning through the fuel, a few heartbeats at most, and then the light subsides again to its resting state, a quiet blow that waits for the next breath of the bellows. Your eyes, fixed on this opening for many minutes at a stretch, begin to notice finer details that a casual observer would miss. The surface of the molten glass inside the crucible, for example, is not perfectly still even when no one is working it. A slow convection stirs the liquid from below, and on the bright surface this movement appears as faint, lazy ripples that distort the light passing through them, creating tiny lenses of brightness that wink into existence and then smooth away again. You can see these ripples only on the strongest downstrokes, when the increased light makes the contrasts sharper, and even then they are so subtle that you might be imagining them, a trick of tired eyes after a long day, but you have seen them too many times across too many nights to doubt their reality. Above the glory hole, the brick arch that frames it is marked with a thin layer of vaporized glass that has condensed out of the furnace atmosphere over time, a glossy black sheen that catches the light and throws it back in tiny sparkles whenever the fire surges. This deposit is called furnace glass, a waste product that has no use, but that the older servants sometimes chip off in flakes to give to children as shiny trinkets. The arch itself is composed of wedge-shaped bricks laid in a tight curve, their inner edges darkened to a charcoal grey where the heat has been most relentless, their outer edges still showing the original terracotta color of the kiln-fired clay. The mortar between them is stained with smoke and age, a deep brown crumbly line that traces the pattern of the masonry like ink in a drawing. Below the glory hole, at the base of the furnace wall, there is a small accumulation of fine ash that has spilled out when the firebox door was opened for stoking. This ash is as soft as talcum powder and almost white, the remains of alder wood burned completely to its mineral skeleton, and it shifts slightly in the draft created by your movements at the bellows. A few stray bits of charcoal, small black chunks that did not quite finish burning, are mixed into the ash, and they reflect no light at all, appearing as pure voids against the pale dust. The contrast between the bright hole above and the dark floor below is sharp enough that your eyes must constantly adjust as your gaze moves between them, the pupils opening and closing in a slow rhythm that matches the pulse of the furnace. Along the edges of the glory hole, built up over years of use, there is a thin ring of crystallized material that the glassblowers call the Ring of Tears. This ring forms when molten glass dribbles from the gather and falls against the cooler bricks, solidifying instantly into a smooth, glossy rim that builds up layer by layer until it is a finger's width thick. The ring catches the firelight in a particularly beautiful way because the glass that composes it is not uniform in color, some layers having cooled faster than others, and so taking on different tints, a mix of pale green from the iron in the sand, faint blue from the copper in the kiln bricks, and a deep wine tint that nobody can quite explain. When the glory hole brightens on a downstroke, the Ring of Tears glows like a circlet of semi-precious stones, each individual drip and runnel catching the light at its own angle and throwing it back into the workshop. Your own small reflection sometimes appears in the glossy surface of the ring, a distorted miniature of your face and shoulders that wavers as the heat haze bends the air between you and the furnace. You do not study this reflection because it is too small and too warped to serve as a mirror, but you are aware of its presence, as you are aware of your own shadow on the floor, a proof that you exist in this space and this time, a participant in the long chain of servants and masters who have stood before this same glow. The reflection vanishes when the fire dims and reappears when it brightens, a flickering self-portrait painted by a furnace that has no eyes, but somehow still bears witness. The longer you watch the glory hole, the more it seems to possess a kind of slow personality, not a mind or a will, but a character formed by the habits of its fuel and the architecture of its brick enclosure. Some nights the fire burns with a steady, even-tempered glow that never flickers or wavers, a patient companion that asks for nothing more than the regular breath of the bellows. Other nights the fire is unsettled, spitting small sparks through the opening, flaring up unexpectedly, and then dying back just as quickly, responding to drafts of air that sneak through the workshop door or to pockets of damp wood that hiss and pop as their moisture boils away. Tonight the furnace seems to be in a calm mood, the fire burning steadily, the glass inside the crucible resting at an even temperature, the lights soft and predictable, a constant reassurance in the darkness. This steadiness allows your mind to sink deeper into the act of watching, until the watching itself becomes a kind of meditation, a state of relaxed attention that asks no questions and arrives at no conclusions. The details of the glory hole scroll past your awareness one by one, the way a single bubble of gas rises through the liquid glass and bursts with a near-silent pop, the way a fine crack in the brick above the opening seems to glow from within when the fire is at its brightest, the way a wisp of smoke curls up from the edge of the firebox door and disappears into the shadows of the ceiling. Each detail is noted and then released, drifting away like a leaf on the canal, and the next detail presents itself without hurry or demand. The color of the light itself begins to work on your mood in a way that is difficult to describe, but easy to feel. The warm orange and amber tones are the colors of firelight the world over, the colors that human beings have watched since the first hearth was lit in the mouth of a cave, and something deep in the brain responds to them with a sense of safety and calm. The glory hole, in this sense, is not merely a window into a technical process, but also a kind of primitive beacon, a signal that the darkness has been held back and that warmth and shelter are available for those who need them. You do not think these thoughts in words, but you feel their substance in the relaxation of your shoulders and the slowing of your breath. a response that is older than language. Now and then, when you least expect it, the glory hole will produce a brief phenomenon of unexpected beauty. A small gift that the furnace offers without warning and then withdraws. A stray ash from the firebox will drift upward through the opening and catch the light, becoming for a moment a tiny floating star, a speck of pure white heat that drifts on the convection currents and then winks out. Or a droplet of condensation from the ceiling, dislodged by the rising warmth, will fall through the beam of light and flash like a falling gemstone before it evaporates halfway to the floor. These incidents are rare but memorable, and they remind you that even in the most repetitive and uneventful occupation, the world still finds ways to surprise. As the minutes stretch on and the night deepens, the glory hole continues its steady display, and you continue to watch it with the same patient attention that a sailor watches the horizon or a shepherd watches the stars. The bellows keep moving under your hands, the air keeps flowing through the tuyere, the fire keeps burning in its brick chamber, and the light remains, constant and calming, at the center of the dark workshop. And so the first hour passes, and then the second, and the glow of the glory hole becomes not just something you see, but something you inhabit. A warm circle of safety that holds you in its gentle regard while the rest of the world sleeps. From the darker end of the workshop, where the tool racks stand in deep shadow, you hear the soft scuff of a leather shoe on packed earth. The sound is so familiar that you do not turn your head, recognizing it immediately as the master glassblower arriving for his portion of the night shift. He moves without hurry, his footfalls spaced evenly, and after a moment his shape appears at the edge of the furnace light, a tall outline that gradually resolves into the details of a man in his middle years wearing a heavy canvas apron over a woolen tunic. His sleeves are rolled to the elbow, and the skin of his forearm shows the faint, shiny marks of old burns that have healed over many seasons, a common feature among those who work close to the glory hole. He carries a small wooden cup of water, which he sets on the corner of the marva before turning to survey the furnace and the bellows, checking with a single slow glance that all is as it should be. His eyes meet yours for a brief moment, and he gives you the smallest nod, a gesture that is less a greeting than a confirmation that the shift is proceeding normally. You nod back, your hands never pausing on the bellows handle, because the fire must not lose its air supply even for those few seconds of acknowledgement. The master then turns away and walks to the pipe rack, a long wooden stand mounted to the wall where a dozen blowpipes rest in angled slots, their iron lengths protruding into the room like the pipes of some silent musical instrument. The blowpipes are hollow tubes, roughly 4 feet long, made of iron darkened by heat and age, and each one has a mouthpiece at one end and a slightly flared tip at the other, where the glass gather is collected. The master runs his fingers lightly over the ends of several pipes, feeling for the one that has the right balance and weight for the work he intends to do tonight, and his selection is made without drama, a simple sliding of one pipe from the rack that he then carries back toward the furnace. The master approaches the glory hole with the blowpipe held in both hands, one gripping near the mouthpiece and the other further down the shaft, and he does not flinch as he steps into the zone of strongest heat. He has done this for more years than you have been alive, and his face remains calm and unguarded, the skin of his cheeks and brow accustomed to the radiant warmth. He pushes the flared tip of the blowpipe through the opening and into the molten glass, and you watch the metal disappear into the bright liquid, the tip becoming a dark silhouette against the glowing pool for a moment, before it sinks beneath the surface. The master then begins to turn the pipe slowly between his palms, a smooth rotation that gathers a gobe of glass onto the end, the liquid material adhering to the hot iron in a thick honey-like coil. The turning is steady and unhurried, each rotation pulling a little more glass from the crucible until the gather has reached the size of a small apple, a round mass of glowing amber that clings to the pipe's tip and drips very slightly under its own weight. He withdraws the pipe from the furnace in one continuous motion, bringing the gathered glass out into the cooler air of the workshop, and immediately the color of the gob begins to change. Inside the furnace it had been the same deep orange as its surroundings, but now, exposed to air that is merely warm rather than scorching, the surface cools just enough to shift toward a brighter, more translucent shade, a color like a sunset captured in a drop of water. The master does not pause to admire this transformation because the glass is already cooling too quickly, and so he steps to the marva, a flat slab of polished iron set on a sturdy wooden table to the right of the furnace, and there he begins to roll the pipe back and forth. The marva surface is cool relative to the glass and draws heat from it rapidly, creating a thin skin on the outside of the gather while the interior remains soft and workable. The master rolls with a practiced rhythm, pushing the pipe forward with one hand and pulling it back with the other, and the glass turns with the pipe, its soft round shape pressing against the iron and slowly elongating into a neat cylinder that will become the basis for a drinking vessel. The sound of the rolling is a low, regular rumble, the iron pipe turning on the iron table with a noise like a heavy stone grinding gently against another stone, and this sound joins with the whoosh of the bellows and the hum of the furnace to form the full music of the workshop. You continue to work the bellows while the master shapes the gather, and your rhythm adapts naturally to his, the two of you falling into a shared tempo that needs no spoken coordination. When the master returns the glass to the glory hole for reheating, you push a little more air into the furnace to keep the temperature high, and when he withdraws the pipe and steps back to the marva, you ease slightly on the downstroke, an unconscious adjustment that maintains the steady burn of the fire without wasting fuel. The master reheats the glass 3 separate times in the course of shaping the vessel, and each time he holds the pipe in the glory hole for a period that you have learned to gauge by counting your own bellow strokes. The first reheat takes 7 strokes, the second takes 5, and the third takes only 4, because the glass retains more heat with each cycle and requires less time to soften again. During the reheating, the master turns the pipe constantly even inside the furnace, keeping the glass moving so that it does not sag or drip under the pull of its own weight, and this constant rotation produces a faint corkscrew pattern in the light that escapes around the pipe, a twisting shadow that plays across the glory hole's rim and then disappears. After the first reheat, the master returns to the marva and resumes rolling. But now he adds a new motion. He tips the pipe slightly downward so that the glass, which is soft enough to respond to gravity, begins to stretch lengthwise under its own weight. The cylinder elongates by a finger's width, becoming slightly thinner in the middle, and the master controls this stretching with the same calm attention that a potter guides clay on a wheel. He then picks up a wooden paddle from a small bucket of water that sits by the marva, a paddle shaped like a flattened spoon and soaked through to prevent scorching, and he uses it to pat the glass gently into a more uniform shape, the damp wood hissing softly each time it touches the hot surface. A tiny cloud of steam rises from each contact and vanishes into the darkness above. The master blows into the pipe now, a short, measured puff that sends air through the hollow iron and into the center of the glass gather. He seals the mouthpiece with his thumb between puffs, trapping the air inside so that it expands the glass from within, and a small bubble begins to form in the heart of the gather. You cannot see this bubble directly because the glass is still too thick and milky, but you can see the shape of the gather change, its surface stretching smoothly outward as the internal pressure pushes against the soft walls. The master pauses to reheat once more, holding the bubble briefly in the glory hole until the glass glows a uniform peachy orange all the way through, and then he returns to the marva and blows again, a longer breath this time that enlarges the bubble, until it is the size of a large orange. The vessel takes shape under his hands with a kind of quiet inevitability, as if the final form of the goblet were already present inside the gather, and all the master had to do was coax it outward. He uses small wooden calipers to measure the diameter of the bubble, checking it against a mark scratched into the side of the marva, and then he switches tools, picking up a pair of iron jacks that look like oversized tweezers with flat blades at the tips. With these jacks he pinches the base of the bubble, creating a construction that will become the stem of the goblet, and the glass flows plastically under the pressure, narrowing into a waist, and then flaring out again into the bowl above and the foot below. The master turns the pipe all the while, never letting the glass stay in one position long enough to droop, and the whole operation proceeds with such fluid grace that it seems almost like a dance, a slow and solemn choreography between a man and a material that has been practiced since the days of the Roman furnaces. You watch all of this from your station at the bellows, your hands continuing their own repeated motion without need for thought, and you feel a quiet satisfaction in seeing the vessel grow toward completion. The master's skill is something you admire without envy, because you know that his hands have spent decades learning what the glass requires and your own place in the workshop, humble though it may be, is essential to the work that he does. Without the bellows, the furnace would cool, and the glass would stiffen, and the delicate bubble would collapse into a misshapen lump. You are the steady foundation on which the master's art rests, and this knowledge brings a kind of peaceful contentment that fills the long hours of the night shift. By the time the master has finished shaping the goblet, blowing it to its final size and pinching the foot with the jacks until it stands flat, the vessel is no longer brightly glowing but has faded to a dull, cherry red, a sign that the glass has cooled below the point where it can be shaped further. The master wraps the finished piece in a small cradle of newspaper that he keeps folded in his apron pocket, and he uses a pair of heavy shears to snip the vessel free from the blowpipe, catching the goblet in his gloved hand as it drops. He then carries the goblet carefully across the workshop to the annealing oven, a smaller brick chamber built into the wall opposite the furnace, where it will cool slowly over the next day and a half, shedding the internal stresses that would otherwise cause it to shatter when touched. The master places the goblet inside the annealing oven on a bed of fine sand and closes the small iron door, and then he returns to the pipe rack to hang the warm blowpipe and select another, beginning the process again with a fresh gather. The night continues in this manner, the master shaping vessel after vessel, while you keep the furnace fed with a steady stream of air, and the pattern of the work has a calming regularity that wraps around you like a blanket. Each goblet emerges from the same sequence of steps, the gather and the roll and the reheat and the blow and the pinch and the snip. And yet no two goblets are exactly alike, because the glass is a living material that responds to the slightest variations in temperature and humidity, and the master's own breath. The master never hurries, and he never hesitates. His movements are as steady as the ticking of the great clock in the Piazza San Marco, which you have never seen but have heard described by sailors who pass through the workshop on their way to the docks. And as you watch him work, your hand still pushing and pulling the bellows handle, you feel the night deepening around you, the hours slipping past in a slow procession of gathered glass and glowing bubbles, and the soft hush of steam rising from the damp paddle. The pull of the bellows becomes the silent teacher of the body, and the body is an eager student that learns by doing. Your arms no longer remember a time before this motion, this lifting and pressing that has filled the workshop with its steady sound for what feels like a very long stretch that has no clear beginning and no visible end. The wooden handle has warmed to the exact temperature of your palms, not hot and not cool, simply present and solid, a constant that you hold as much as it holds you. The rhythm has passed beyond counting, beyond any conscious measure of strokes per minute, and now exists as a continuous flow, one breath of the furnace blending into the next, until the boundary between one stroke and another dissolves like a single wave dissolving into the calm surface of the lagoon. Your body moves through the full cycle with an economy that comes only after many hours of practice, the unnecessary adjustments long since eliminated, the wasted energy long since conserved. On the upstroke, your shoulders roll backward, while your elbows straighten and your chest opens to the warm air, a motion that feels like a slow and generous inhale. On the downstroke, your weight shifts forward from your heels to the balls of your feet, your knees soften, your back rounds just slightly, and your hands guide the handle downward with the same gentle insistence that a boatman uses to dip an oar. Between these two poles of effort there is no pause, no rest, only a continuous pendulum swing that carries you from one extreme to the other without the slightest hesitation. The bellows themselves seem to cooperate, the leather gussets flexing with a low creak that has become so familiar you no longer hear it as sound, but rather as a texture in the air, a rough smooth vibration that presses against your eardrums with the same neutrality as the darkness pressing against the workshop walls. The task has no surprises in it, none at all, and that is the quality that makes it so strangely restful even as it demands a steady output of physical effort. Every upstroke is identical to every other upstroke, a predictable gathering of air into the leather chambers, a small wooden clack that clicks open and then clicks shut, a faint whisper of the outside atmosphere entering the bellows to replace the air that has just been expelled. Every downstroke sends that same package of oxygen through the iron tire and into the firebox, and the fire responds with the same small surge of brightness, the same deepening of the orange glow, the same gentle expansion of the heat that washes across your face and then recedes. You could not become lost in this work because there is nothing to find, no problem to solve, no decision to make, no outcome to await. There is only the work itself, pure and complete in each moment, requiring nothing from you beyond what you are already giving. The soundscape of the repetition is a deep and layered thing that your ears explore without the direction of your mind. The primary sound is the whoosh of the downstroke, a low and breathy noise that starts when the handle is about halfway down and continues until it reaches the bottom of its travel. A sound like wind moving through a stand of pines, steady and smooth and soft at its edges. Beneath this whoosh is the creak of the leather, which is actually many small creaks that happen together. The sound of fibers stretching and wooden boards flexing and iron hinges rotating, all of them combining into a single low groan that underlines the whoosh with a woody, organic texture. The clack valve contributes its tiny click on the upstroke, a sound so small that you only notice it when you are paying no attention at all. And yet it is always there, marking the moment when the old air has gone and the new air is arriving. And below all of these is the furnace hum, the constant bass note of the workshop, a sound made by the fire consuming wood and the glass moving slowly in its crucible, and the bricks expanding in their ancient mortar. A sound that never stops, never changes, never rises or falls, but simply continues like the note of a distant bell that has been struck once and will ring until the end of time. Your breathing has by now synchronized completely with the bellows, not because you decided to match them, but because the body finds its own patterns when the mind steps aside. You exhale as the handle goes down, a long, slow release of breath that empties your lungs in time with the emptying of the bellows chamber. And you inhale as the handle rises, drawing air into your chest while the leather draws air into its own cavity. The two processes, the mechanical and the biological, have become a single rhythm, so that you are breathing for the furnace, and the furnace is breathing for you, a symbiotic exchange that blurs the line between the servant and the served. Your heart beats at its own pace, a steady 60-something per minute, and that beat sits inside the bellows rhythm like a smaller rhythm inside a larger one, the way the ripples from a raindrop sit inside the larger swells of the canal. Time, which in the beginning of the shift had a certain crispness to its passage, a sense of moments piling one on top of another like coins on a counter, has now lost that crispness and become something softer, something more like a fog that drifts through the workshop without regard for clocks or bells. You have no idea how many minutes have passed since the master finished his last vessel, or how many hours remain before the first grey light of dawn will seep through the high window. The very concept of minutes begins to feel abstract and distant, a human invention that has no place in the warm, dark room where the only real measurement is the slow consumption of fuel in the firebox and the slow accumulation of finished goblets on the annealing tray. You are not bored because boredom requires a desire for something to happen, and you have no such desire. You are not tired in the sense of wanting to stop, because the rhythm carries you forward without your will needing to push. You are simply present, existing in the motion, a point of awareness suspended in the warm amber glow like a speck of ash floating on an updraft. Small physical sensations come and go, reporting themselves to your brain and then fading away without demanding a response. A tiny patch of skin on your left palm, where a callus has begun to thicken over the last few weeks, makes itself known as a slight warmth, a faint friction against the wood that is not pain and not pleasure, but simply information. The muscle that runs along the top of your right shoulder, a muscle whose name you have never learned, makes itself known as a dull ache that appears on the upstroke and disappears on the downstroke, a minor protest that the body files away and ignores. Your lower back, at the very base of the spine where the weight of your torso transfers into your legs, develops a small knot of tension that loosens when you shift your stance by half an inch and then slowly tightens again over the next 100 strokes. None of these sensations are strong enough to distract you from the work, and none of them are novel enough to capture your attention. They are simply the language of the body, doing what it was built to do. A quiet conversation between muscle and bone that has been ongoing since the first hominid stood upright and walked across the savannah. The master works on at his own bench, a darker shape moving at the edge of the furnace light, and the sounds of his labor drift across the workshop to join the sounds of yours. You hear the soft hiss of the damp paddle touching the hot glass, a sound that always seems to come in pairs, two quick hisses and then a pause while the master inspects the shape. You hear the gritty rumble of the blowpipe rolling on the marver, a sound that lasts for 5 or 6 of your bellows strokes and then stops while the master moves back to the glory hole for another reheat. You hear the gentle tap of iron jacks being set down on the wooden bench, a small ringing tap that is the most musical sound in the workshop, a clean note that cuts through the low drone of the furnace and then fades. These sounds from the master's work serve as a kind of punctuation in the long sentence of your own repetition, marking the completion of one vessel and the beginning of another, and yet they do not interrupt the flow of your attention because they are as familiar as everything else in this room, as expected as the next pull of the bellows handle. Your mind, freed from the need to manage the body, drifts in the gentle currents of its own idle thought. The thoughts that come are not purposeful or urgent. They are more like leaves floating on the surface of a slow river, each one appearing from somewhere upstream, drifting for a while in the sun, and then slipping away around a bend. You might think for a few moments about the canal outside, about the dark water and the sleeping boats and the barnacles on the stone steps, and then that thought will dissolve and be replaced by a memory of a meal you ate earlier in the day, a bowl of bean soup with a piece of hard bread, the taste of the rosemary still faintly present in the back of your mouth. That memory too will drift away, and you will find yourself simply resting in the sensation of the bellows handle moving under your hands, not thinking about anything at all, just watching the light shift in the glory hole with a quiet attention that has no object and no goal. There is a deep patience in this state, a patience that the waking world rarely allows, and you sink into it as you would sink into a warm bath after a long day of walking. The repetition of the task might seem, to someone who has never done it, like a burden to be endured, a dull and lifeless interval between the beginning of the shift and its end. But you have learned over many nights in this workshop that repetition has its own secret generosity, a gift that it offers only to those who stop resisting it. When the same motion is performed again and again without resistance, the motion stops being something you do and starts being something you are, a quality of existence rather than an action. The bellows are not something you operate. You are the part of the bellows that provides the will, the living motor attached to the leather and wood, and the furnace is not something you serve. It is the warm center around which your whole being arranges itself. This blurring of the boundary between self and task, between agent and action, is not a loss but a release, a gentle setting aside of the usual burden of being a separate person with a separate fate. The air in the workshop remains exactly as warm as it has been for the past several hours, the heat banked in the bricks radiating steadily outward, and the fresh heat from the fire replacing whatever escapes through the walls and the window. The temperature is high enough that you never feel cool, but not so high that you feel oppressed. It is the temperature of a perfect summer evening, the kind of evening when you can sit outside without a cloak and watch the sky change color until the first stars appear. Your skin has adjusted to it completely, the pores open and the blood vessels dilated, and the sweat that forms on your brow evaporates instantly into the dry air, carrying away the excess heat from your working muscles. You are comfortable in exactly the way that a gear is comfortable inside a well-made clock, fitting perfectly into the space designed for it and turning in harmony with the other gears around it. As the hours continue their slow drift, the rhythm of the bellows undergoes a subtle change that you are only dimly aware of, a slowing that is not deliberate but that reflects the natural fatigue of the body. The strokes remain regular, but each upstroke takes a fraction of a heartbeat longer, and each downstroke releases its air with a slightly softer push. The fire dims by a degree, not enough that the glass would stiffen, but enough that the master must hold the blowpipe in the glory hole for an extra stroke or two to achieve the same reheat. This slowing is not a failure of attention or a sign that you're losing your capacity. It is simply the body's wisdom asserting itself, finding a sustainable pace that can be maintained until dawn without exhausting the reserves. You trust this wisdom because you have learned to trust it, and you make no effort to push back against the slight deceleration, allowing the bellows to find their natural tempo in the same way that a swinging pendulum finds its natural period. The darkness beyond the reach of the furnace glow remains absolute, a deep black that seems to have weight and texture, filling the corners of the workshop and pressing against the walls. If you were to leave the bellows and walk to the door, a journey of perhaps 20 steps, the darkness would swallow you before you were halfway there, and you would have to feel your way forward with outstretched hands, finding the water bucket and the tool rack and the peg where your cloak hangs by memory rather than by sight. But you have no reason to make that journey because everything you need is right here in the warm circle of light, the bellows handle under your hands, the glory hole pulsing before your eyes, and the master's quiet presence at the edge of your vision. The darkness, far from being threatening, is a kind of insulation, a thick cushion that wraps around the workshop and keeps the outside world at a safe distance, protecting the fragile bubble of warmth and light where the glass takes shape. The repetition continues without incident, without interruption, without any marker to distinguish this particular stretch of the night from any other. Each downstroke feeds the fire, each upstroke gathers the air. Each breath of your lungs matches the cycle, each passing moment dissolves into the next. The glory hole glows with its steady apricot light. The ring of tears sparkles faintly on the brick rim, and the master's shadow moves back and forth between the furnace and the marble with the regularity of a slow metronome. You are aware in some distant part of your mind that the dawn will come eventually, that the sky will lighten, and the birds will begin to call, and your shift will reach its end. But that awareness has no urgency, no eager quality of waiting. The dawn can take its time, and so can you. For now there is only the pull and the push, the sound and the glow, the endless middle of the night stretching out in all directions, and that is more than enough. The workshop settles into a depth of nighttime stillness that goes beyond mere quiet, a stillness so complete that it seems to have its own substance, a thick and patient presence that fills every corner and presses gently against the eardrums. The bellows continue their work under your hands, the whoosh and the creak cycling onward, but these sounds have become so deeply woven into the fabric of the night that they no longer register as interruptions to the silence, but rather as part of it, the way the slow breathing of a sleeper becomes part of the stillness of a dark bedroom. The furnace hum remains as well, that constant low note that vibrates in the bricks and the floor and the wooden handle under your palms, and together these sounds form a sort of audible stillness, a quiet that is not the absence of noise but the presence of only the most familiar and expected noises. Sounds that the mind has long since filed away under the category of things that require no attention. The glory hole shines with a patient, unwavering light that seems to have reached a state of perfect equilibrium, neither brightening nor dimming across long stretches of time, but simply holding steady at a soft, golden peach glow that could continue forever without change. The fire inside the furnace has found its ideal balance between fuel and air, the alder wood burning down to embers at exactly the same rate that fresh heat is required, and so the light does not flicker or pulse but remains constant, a fixed point of warmth in a world that is otherwise entirely dark. This steadiness gives the glory hole a quality that is almost like the light of a painted sun in an old fresco, a light that has been shining for so long that it has become part of the architecture, as permanent and reliable as the bricks that frame it. The soot-darkened ceiling beams, those heavy lengths of old timber that span the width of the workshop high above your head, are painted by this light in faint strokes of copper and dull gold, their undersides catching just enough radiance to reveal the rough grain of the wood and the tiny knots that dot its surface like closed eyes. The beams are very old, older than the furnace itself, salvaged from some earlier building and installed here when the workshop was first constructed, and they have absorbed decades of smoke and ash into their fibers until the wood has become a deep, lusterless black that reflects almost nothing. And yet, at this late hour of the night, when the fire has been burning steadily for many hours and the heat has penetrated every corner of the room, those beams seem to glow with a faint warmth of their own, a dim, borrowed light that is barely visible unless you look directly at them for several seconds, allowing your eyes to adjust fully to the darkness. They stretch across the ceiling in parallel lines, these old beams, and the spaces between them are pools of absolute black where the light from the glory hole cannot reach, creating a pattern of dark and slightly less dark that repeats like stripes on the fabric of the night. The bricks of the furnace wall have stored up an immense quantity of warmth over the course of the shift. each one acting as a kind of heat reservoir that absorbed the fire's energy during the early hours and now radiates it slowly back into the room. If you were to walk over to the furnace and lay your hand flat against the brick, which you do not do because your hands are occupied with the bellows, you would feel a steady, penetrating warmth that is not hot enough to burn, but is hot enough to make your palm tingle and your fingers grow supple. This stored heat is what allows the workshop to remain comfortable even when the firebox door is opened. The stoking in a brief draft of cooler air sweeps across the floor. The bricks themselves hold the temperature steady, releasing their bounty of warmth in slow, invisible waves that travel outward in all directions. The very oldest bricks, the ones at the base of the furnace that were laid when the first glassblower lit the first fire in this building generations ago, have been heated and cooled so many thousands of times that their clay has undergone a permanent change, becoming harder and denser and more resistant to cracking, as if the fire has slowly transformed them into a kind of artificial stone. The master has paused in his work for a span of time that might be a few minutes or might be longer, taking a seat on a low wooden stool near the water bucket while the last goblet cools in the annealing oven. He sits with his back straight and his hands resting on his knees, a posture of patient rest that does not slump or sprawl, and his gaze is directed toward the glory hole in the same way that your own gaze is directed there, not watching anything in particular, but simply resting on the warm light. His blowpipe leans against the marva table, its tip still faintly glowing with the residue of the last gather, and the wooden paddle floats in its bucket of water with a slow-turning motion that produces the tiniest ripples on the surface. The master does not speak, and neither do you, because there is nothing that needs to be said, and because speaking would disturb the deep quiet that has settled over the workshop like a layer of fine dust. The two of you simply exist in the same space, sharing the warmth and the light and the silence, cooperating in the wordless way that people cooperate when they have worked together long enough to know each other's rhythms without the need for language. During these long pauses between the master's actions, when the glass waits in the crucible and the blowpipe rests against the marva and the only active work happening in the workshop is your steady hauling of the bellows, the silence seems to grow even deeper, settling into the room like water settling into a dry sponge. You can hear in these moments the almost inaudible hiss of the fire as it consumes the wood in the firebox, a sound that is so faint that it exists at the very edge of perception, a soft sibilance that might be mistaken for the sound of your own blood moving through the vessels near your ears. The hiss is the sound of combustion, the sound of solid wood transforming into gas and heat and light, and it carries with it a faint crackling undertone that is equally quiet, a tiny percussion of popping fibers and collapsing ash that plays continuously beneath the larger sounds of the workshop. To hear these delicate noises requires a certain stillness of attention, a willingness to let the louder sounds fade into the background while the ear reaches out for the quieter ones, and you have learned over many nights to do exactly that, allowing your hearing to become sensitive to the full depth of the workshop's soundscape. The sound on the floor, that packed mix of earth and brick dust that cushions your feet, has its own small contribution to make to the silence. When you shift your weight from one foot to the other, which happens every few minutes as your body unconsciously adjusts its stance, the sand makes a soft grinding sound, a minute crunch of particles sliding over one another, that is so quiet it barely registers. The leather of your slippers makes an even quieter sound, a faint rubbing against the packed earth that is more a sensation in the soles of your feet than an audible noise. Every material in the workshop, from the wooden beams overhead, to the iron tools on the rack, to the clay pots of colorants waiting on the shelf, has a different relationship to sound, a different way of absorbing or reflecting the vibrations that move through the air. And the overall effect is of a room that has been acoustically tuned by centuries of use to be as quiet as possible. A room where sound does not echo or reverberate, but is instead absorbed and transformed into a gentle hush. The high window, that narrow slit in the wall that looks out onto the canal, shows nothing at all now, a perfect rectangle of black that is indistinguishable from the dark wall around it. If a person was standing outside at this hour, which would be very unusual because the island is asleep, and the boats are moored and the only people awake are the night workers in the various furnaces scattered across Murano, they would see a faint orange glow escaping from that window, a dim square of light that seems to hover in the darkness like a captive firefly. From inside the workshop, looking outward, The window reveals nothing because the darkness on both sides of the glass is equally complete, and so the glass pane, which is a small roundel of thick, imperfect Murano glass with a bullseye swirl at its center, simply reflects back a distorted image of the glory hole, a tiny duplicate sun that hangs in the blackness like a pendant. The silence outside the workshop is even deeper than the silence within, a nighttime quiet that settles over the entire lagoon and muffles every sound except the gentle slap of water against the canal walls. The other furnaces on Murano, the ones that run night shifts like this one, are distant enough that their hums do not carry, or perhaps they are located on the far side of the island, and their sound is blocked by the intervening buildings. The bell tower of San Pietro Martir, which chimes the hours during the day, is silent now, its bells resting in their wooden cradle until the morning Angelus calls them back to life. Even the seabirds are quiet, the gulls having tucked their heads beneath their wings and settled on the rooftops, the ducks having drifted into the marshes at the edge of the island, where the reeds give them shelter from the night wind. The whole world outside the workshop seems to be holding its breath, waiting for the first pale hint of dawn to appear above the Adriatic. And inside the workshop the furnace breathes for everyone, its steady glow a small defiance of the darkness that presses against the walls. You listen to the silence and the near silence, the hiss and the hum and the whoosh, and you feel your attention gradually withdrawing from the outer edges of your awareness and settling into a smaller, more concentrated space, somewhere behind your eyes. This is a familiar sensation, one that occurs during the deepest part of every night shift, when the body has fully accepted the rhythm of the work and the mind has exhausted its supply of interesting thoughts, and the only thing left is pure perception without commentary. You watch the glory hole, and you do not think about the glory hole. You hear the bellows, and you do not think about the bellows. You feel the warmth on your face and the wood under your hands, and you do not think about any of it. The thoughts have stopped, or rather they have slowed to such a low level that they no longer have any weight or momentum, drifting through your awareness like clouds through a high, empty sky, touching nothing and leaving no trace. The master rises from his stool after the pause has reached its natural conclusion, a conclusion that neither of you could have predicted in advance, but that both of you recognize when it arrives. He walks to the Marva and picks up the blowpipe, its tit now cooled to a dull grey, and he returns to the glory hole to begin the next gather. The routine resumes with the same quiet precision as before. The pipe enters the opening, the tip sinks into the molten glass, the slow rotation begins, and the gob of glowing material emerges into the workshop air, trailing a faint wisp of smoke from the hot iron. The master rolls the gather on the Marva, the low grinding sound joining the other sounds, and the silence of the workshop adjusts to accommodate this new activity without losing its essential quality. The stillness remains. It simply incorporates the master's movements as it has incorporated your own, folding them into its patient embrace. The glory hole, which had dimmed almost imperceptibly during the long pause, brightens again as the fresh air from your bellows reaches the fire, and the cycle of light and sound and warmth continues exactly as it has been continuing for hours, exactly as it will continue for hours more. A closed loop of cause and effect that requires nothing from you except your presence and your steady hands. The night deepens toward its darkest point, that hour just before the first hint of dawn when the world seems to hold its breath most tightly, and the furnace glows on in its brick chamber, a small captive sun that asks for nothing but the simple rhythm of the bellows and the quiet company of the servant who keeps them moving. The master stands before the glory hole, with a fresh blowpipe resting in his hands, the iron still cool enough that the air around it does not shimmer, and he pushes the tip through the opening and into the molten glass with the same unhurried precision that he has shown all night. The gather that he draws out this time is slightly larger than the ones before, a round mass of glowing amber roughly the size of a small quince, and as it emerges from the furnace it carries with it a trailing thread of liquid glass that stretches thin and then breaks, the loose end curling back on itself like a fern frond, and freezing into a delicate squiggle that falls to the ash-dusted floor. The master does not notice this small byproduct of his work, or if he notices he does not care, because his attention is entirely on the gather itself, which is already beginning to cool from a bright tangerine to a deeper, more muted orange as the outside air draws heat from its surface. He steps to the Marva and begins to roll the pipe, the glass pressing against the polished iron with a gritty whisper that sounds like a heavy stone turning on a fine-grained whetstone. The gather, which was a loose and slightly lopsided sphere when it left the furnace, becomes more symmetrical with each rotation, the cool surface of the marva drawing heat evenly from all sides and creating a stiff outer skin while the interior remains soft and pliable. The master rolls for perhaps 30 of your bellows strokes, a period that you have learned to measure without counting, and then he lifts the pipe and holds it with the gather pointing downward, allowing gravity to pull the soft glass into a slightly elongated shape, a blunt oval that glows a deep, saturated orange like the last arc of the sun before it sinks below the horizon. He raises the blowpipe to his lips now, resting the mouthpiece gently against them, and he blows a short, controlled puff of air into the hollow iron tube. The air travels down the pipe and emerges at the tip, pressing outward against the hot glass from the inside, and a small bubble begins to form in the heart of the gather. You cannot see the bubble itself because the glass around it is still too thick and too cloudy with heat to be transparent, but you can see the effects that the bubble has on the overall shape. A slight swelling that rounds the elongated oval into a more spherical form and makes the surface of the glass tense slightly, like a leather wineskin being filled. The master removes the pipe from his lips and seals the mouthpiece with his thumb, trapping the air inside so that it cannot escape. And the pressure of that trapped air continues to push outward against the soft walls of the gather, expanding the bubble by a tiny amount even without additional breath. He steps back to the glory hole and inserts the gather through the opening, holding it in the intense heat while he turns the pipe constantly between his fingers, a rotation that keeps the glass moving so that it does not sag or drip under the pull of gravity. The glory hole brightens around the pipe, its light seeming to welcome the glass back into the furnace, and the gather quickly warms to a brilliant, luminous tangerine that is almost too bright to look at directly, a color that seems to generate its own light rather than simply reflecting the fire. The master counts the reheating time by some internal measure that you have never learned, some sense that tells him exactly when the glass has reached the perfect temperature for the next step, and after a period that is slightly shorter than the last reheat he withdraws the pipe and brings the glowing gather back to the marva. He blows again, a longer breath this time, and the bubble inside the gather grows larger, pushing the walls outward until the glass is no longer a solid mass, but a hollow form, a thick-walled bubble that glows with a uniform peachy light all across its surface. The master turns the pipe constantly as he blows, never letting the glass rest in one position long enough for gravity to pull it out of shape, and the bubble expands symmetrically, its walls thinning at an even rate from all sides. The color of the glass changes as it thins, shifting from the deep orange of the thick gather to a paler, more translucent shade that is closer to the color of fresh honey held up to a candle. And within this paler glass you begin to see the first hints of transparency, a quality that was completely absent from the dense gather but that will define the finished vessel. The master now moves to a different station, a bench that you have not seen him use yet tonight, and there he picks up a small set of iron calipers that lie ready on a folded cloth. The calipers are shaped like a two-pronged fork with curved tips, and the master uses them to measure the diameter of the expanding bubble, checking it against a series of notches filed into the caliper arm, each notch corresponding to a different standard size that the customers in Venice expect from a quality drinking goblet. He finds that the bubble is slightly too narrow at its widest point, and so he returns it to the glory hole for a brief reheat of only 3 of your bellows strokes, and then he blows again, a gentle and sustained breath that enlarges the bubble by exactly the right amount. The calipers confirm the new measurement with a quiet satisfaction, their tips touching the glass on opposite sides and aligning perfectly with the correct notch, and the master sets them down and picks up the wooden paddle instead. The paddle is still wet from its soaking in the water bucket, and when the master brings it into contact with the hot glass, a small burst of steam hisses outward, a tiny white cloud that rises toward the ceiling and vanishes into the dark. The master uses the paddle to shape the bubble, passing it gently into a more perfect sphere and then coaxing the bottom of the bubble into a slightly flatter profile that will eventually become the foot of the goblet. The paddle makes a soft, rhythmic sound as it touches the glass, a sound like a damp cloth being pressed against a warm stone, and after each pat, the master rotates the pipe by a quarter turn and pats again, working his way around the full circumference of the vessel with patient, methodical attention. The glass responds to this treatment by becoming more symmetrical with each pass, its surface smoothing out and its walls achieving a uniform thickness that will be essential for the strength of the finished piece. Now comes the moment that you always find yourself watching most closely, the moment when the master uses the iron jacks to create the stem of the goblet. He picks up the jacks, which are a pair of long iron tongs with flat blades at the tips and wooden handles wrapped in leather, and he positions them at the base of the bubble where the glass meets the blowpipe. With a steady pressure that comes from years of practice rather than from brute strength, he squeezes the jacks closed around the waist of the glass, and the soft material flows inward like clay on a potter's wheel, narrowing into a graceful constriction that separates the bowl of the goblet from its stem. The master turns the pipe constantly as he works the jacks, ensuring that the constriction is perfectly even all the way around, and the glass in that narrow zone blows a brighter orange than the rest of the vessel because it is slightly thinner there, and therefore heats more quickly from the internal warmth of the bubble. The stem begins to take shape under the master's hands. A slender column of glass connects the bowl to the foot, and as it grows longer and thinner, the master switches back to the paddle to flatten the base of the bubble into a disc that will serve as the foot of the goblet. The foot spreads outward on the marver as the master presses down gently, the soft glass flowing under the pressure like thick honey, and the edges of the foot curl up slightly at first, and then are smoothed down by the paddle until they lie flat and even. The whole vessel now has the shape of a proper drinking goblet, with a wide bowl at the top, a narrow stem in the middle, and a flat foot at the bottom, all of it still glowing a warm coral color that is slowly fading toward a deeper, duller red as the glass cools. The master reheats the vessel one final time, holding it in the glory hole for perhaps 5 of your bellows strokes until the glass has regained a uniform, bright orange glow all across its surface, and then he brings it back to the bench for the last adjustments. He uses the jacks to refine the shape of the stem, pinching it just a little more in the middle and smoothing out any irregularities that his fingers can detect through the iron tools. He uses the paddle to flatten the foot one more time, pressing it against the marver until it stands perfectly stable and the goblet can balance on its own when the master sets it briefly on the iron surface. And then he uses a small pair of shears to trim away a tiny excess of glass that is gathered at the very tip of the foot, a small blob of cooled material that drops onto the floor with a soft tick and lies there glowing faintly like a fallen ember. The vessel is now finished, or nearly finished, and the master holds it up for a moment in front of the glory hole so that the light shines through the thin walls of the bowl. The glass, which is cooled to a deep cherry red by this point, transmits the orange glow of the furnace in a way that makes the entire goblet seem to be lit from within, a captive sunset that shifts from coral to pale gold as it continues to lose heat. The walls of the bowl are so thin now that you can see the shadow of the master's hand through them when he turns the pipe, and the stem is a delicate column of translucent amber that narrows to the width of a goose quill at its center. The foot is a flat disc of slightly thicker glass that blows a deeper red than the rest of the vessel, a stable base that will hold the goblet steady on a table without tipping. The whole object, this thing that did not exist an hour ago, is a perfect expression of the glassblower's art, a marriage of skill and heat and breath and the steady rhythm of the bellows that you have provided all night long. You watch this transformation with a quiet appreciation that never quite crosses into pride, because the vessel is not your work, and yet it is not entirely separate from you either. The heat that softened the glass came from the fire that you have been feeding, and the master would not have been able to shape the vessel without that fire, and so you are a part of the process, even if your hands never touch the glass itself. This connection, this indirect participation in the creation of something beautiful, adds a layer of quiet satisfaction to the work of the bellows, a feeling that the effort of your arms and shoulders and back serves a purpose beyond mere endurance. The long hours of the night feel lighter when you watch a goblet emerge from the gather, its round body holding a captured sunset that will remain frozen in the glass, long after the furnace has cooled and the workshop has fallen silent. The master wraps the finished goblet in a small sheet of crumpled paper that he takes from his apron pocket, and he uses the heavy shears to cut the vessel free from the blowpipe, snipping through the glass just above the mouthpiece where the pipe is still cool. The goblet drops into his waiting hand, and he carries it across the workshop to the annealing oven that low brick chamber built into the wall where the other goblets have been resting. He opens the small iron door, and a wave of gentle heat washes out the accumulated warmth of the vessels that had been placed inside over the course of the night. The master sets the new goblet on the bed of fine sand, positioning it so that the foot is level and the bowl is upright, and then he closes the door and turns back toward the furnace, his eyes already moving to the pipe rack where the next blowpipe waits. The annealing oven will hold the goblets at a steady, moderate temperature for more than a day, allowing the glass to cool so slowly that the internal stresses have time to dissipate, the molecules settling into a relaxed arrangement that will not shatter when the glass is handled. This process is invisible and silent, requiring no attention from anyone, and yet without it the master's work would be worthless, because an unannealed goblet can break from the heat of a warm hand or the vibration of a footstep on the floor. The patience of the glass extends even beyond the moment of its shaping into the long, quiet aftermath of cooling, a final act of waiting that the glass performs on its own while the workshop continues its rhythms, and the bellows keep moving, and the glory hole keeps glowing at the center of the dark room. The master picks up a fresh blowpipe and returns to the furnace, and the cycle begins once more with a new gather from the crucible, a new gob of molten amber drawn out of the heat and into the cooler air, where it will be rolled and blown and shaped into another vessel that is both identical to the last and entirely unique. You watch him work with eyes that are growing heavy but that remain attentive, your body still moving through the endless loop of the bellows, your mind still floating in that calm space between wakefulness and dreaming, and the glory hole continues to shine its steady light over everything, the glass and the master and the servant and the old brick furnace, holding the workshop in its warm regard while the night deepens toward its final hours. The master sets down his blowpipe on the rack, with a soft clink of iron resting against iron, and he turns away from the furnace toward a small workbench in the corner, where the finer tools are kept. He needs to rub chalk on a wooden block, a task that belongs to the preparation of the next stage of work, and for a few minutes the area around the glory hole is empty of his presence. The fire continues to burn, the glass continues to wait in its crucible, and you continue to pull the bellows handle up and down with the same steady rhythm. But the workshop feels slightly different when the master is not standing at the center of it, as if the room itself expands by a small measure in his absence. The shadows that his body had been blocking from the furnace light now stretch across the floor unimpeded, long dark rectangles that reach toward the far wall and shift whenever the glory hole brightens on a downstroke. You notice this shift without studying it, the way you notice the changing position of the sun through a window over the course of an afternoon, a background detail that registers without demanding attention. The master is occupied with his block of wood and his lump of white chalk, rubbing the chalk across the wooden surface in long, even strokes that produce a soft scratching sound, a sound like a quill pen moving across a sheet of coarse paper. He does this to create a light dusting of chalk on the block, which will be used to shape the hot glass without sticking to it, and the task requires no concentration, only patience. And so he works slowly, his head bent over the bench in a pose of quiet absorption. In this moment of pause, when the blowpipe is cool and the marver is empty, and the only sounds in the workshop are the bellows in the furnace and the faint scratch of chalk on wood, you allow your attention to drift sideways, away from the glory hole and toward the high window that sits in the wall to your left. The window is a narrow slit, barely wider than the span of two hands, placed palm to palm, and it is set high in the wall, just below the point where the brick meets the roof beams. Its purpose is not to provide a view, but to allow a small amount of ventilation when the workshop grows too hot in the summer months, and to let in a sliver of daylight during the morning shift, so that the workers can see to sweep the floor and clean the tools. At night, the window is a dark rectangle that reflects the glow of the furnace back into the room. But now, as your eyes rest on it, you notice that the reflection has changed, that there is something out there in the darkness beyond the glass that is not simply the blackness of the night sky. A tiny point of light, very faint and very distant, hovers in the center of the window pane. A single distant lantern that bobs slowly where a boat is moored somewhere out on the canal. The light is small and unremarkable, a speck of warm yellow that appears and disappears in a slow rhythm as the boat shifts on the water, the lantern swinging gently from its hook on the stern. You cannot see the boat itself, nor the water that supports it, nor the buildings on the opposite side of the canal, because the darkness outside is too complete, and your eyes have been adjusted to the bright glow of the furnace for too many hours to pick out the subtle shades of the nighttime world. But the lantern is there, a solitary beacon that proves the existence of the outside, a reminder that the lagoon and the island and the sleeping city of Venice all continue to exist even while the workshop has become your entire universe. You watch the light for a few of your bellows strokes, the handle still moving under your hands, and you think about the person who lit that lantern and hung it on the boat. Some fisherman or boatman who is now asleep in a nearby house, trusting the flame to burn safely through the night. The canal outside lies flat and black, a sheet of still water that mirrors nothing because there is no moon tonight, and the stars are hidden behind a thin layer of cloud that rolled in from the Adriatic sometime after sunset. During the day, this same canal is a busy thoroughfare where boats carrying sand and soda ash and bundles of alderwood navigate between the furnaces, where the glassblower's apprentices run errands with baskets of finished goblets wrapped in straw, and where the women of Murano wash their laundry on the stone steps and call greetings to one another across the water. But at this hour, deep in the silent middle of the night, the canal is as still as a painting in a church, its surface undisturbed by oar or keel, its dark water lapping so gently against the stone embankment that the sound does not even carry through the thick workshop walls. The only proof of the canal's existence is that tiny bobbing lantern, and even that seems less like a real object than like a small star that has fallen into the wrong part of the sky. The buildings opposite the workshop are shuttered and dark, their windows covered with wooden panels that show no chink of light, their doors closed and barred against the night. These buildings are workshops and houses much like the one you stand in, some of them glass furnaces that operate on different schedules, others the homes of bead makers and mirror grinders, and the families who have lived on Murano for generations. During the hours of daylight, the alley between the buildings is a narrow canyon of noise and movement, filled with the shouts of workers and the rumble of cartwheels on stone, and the endless chime of glass being cut and polished and packed into crates for export. But now, in the deepest part of the night, all of that activity lies dormant. The people sleeping in their beds, the furnaces banked or attended by silent servants like yourself, the whole island wrapped in a stillness that feels as old as the lagoon itself. You think of the sleepers in their houses, the children curled under wool blankets, the old women snoring softly in their chairs, the dogs lying in the doorways with their noses on their paws, and the thought is a quiet comfort, a sense of connection to the larger human community that shares this island and this night. The air that seeps through the narrow window slit is slightly cooler than the air inside the workshop, cool enough that you can feel it as a thin current against your left cheek when you turn your face toward the opening. This fresh air carries with it the familiar scents of the lagoon at night, the faint salt tang of the seawater that flows in from the Adriatic through the Porto di Lido, the muddy green smell of the marsh grasses on the uninhabited islands to the north, and the clean mineral odor of wet stone from the embankments and the canal steps. Mixed with these outdoor scents is the distant, almost imperceptible smell of wood smoke from other furnaces, a smell that is so constant in Murano that the islanders no longer notice it, the way a baker no longer notices the smell of bread in his own kitchen. You draw a slow breath through your nose, letting this cooler, fresher air mix with the warm, dry air of the workshop, and the combination is pleasant in a way that you could not describe in words, but that you feel as a slight lightening of the weight behind your eyes, a small refreshment that the body welcomes. The lantern on the boat continues its slow bob, and you watch it without watching it, your eyes resting on the small yellow speck while your mind drifts across the quiet surface of the lagoon in an imaginary boat of its own. You think about the water outside, the dark canal flowing between the buildings, and you trace its path in your memory from the workshop to the broader channel that leads past the cemetery island of San Michele, and onward to the open lagoon where the fishing boats set their nets at dusk. The water out there is even darker than the water in the canal, a vast black expanse that stretches to the horizon without a single light to mark its surface. And beneath that water the fish move slowly through the cold depths, the soles and the sea bass and the tiny glittering sardines that the fisherman will catch at dawn. The thought is a peaceful one, an image of the natural world continuing its ancient rhythms while you continue yours, the fish and the water and the night, all moving in their own slow cycles that have nothing to do with the affairs of human beings. The master has finished rubbing chalk on his wooden block, and you hear the soft thump of the block being set down on the bench, followed by the brush of his hands wiping the excess chalk dust onto his apron. He will return to the furnace in a moment, and the cycle of gathering and blowing will resume. But for now, there is still this brief interlude of stillness, this small gap in the night's work that you have filled with the sight of the canal, and the lantern and the sleeping buildings. You take one more slow lungful of the cooler air coming through the window, feeling it reach down into the bottom of your lungs and wash away some of the accumulated warmth of the workshop. And then you turn your face back toward the furnace and the glory hole and the bellows handle that has never stopped moving under your hands. The contrast between the cool darkness of the outside and the warm brightness of the inside makes the workshop seem even cozier than it did before, a pocket of heat and light carved out of the vast nighttime world. The glory hole, which had become so familiar that you almost stopped seeing it, now appears to you with a renewed clarity, its warm orange circle a welcome sight that draws you back into the shelter of the furnace room. The bricks around the opening glow a steady, reassuring red. The ring of tears sparkles faintly along the rim, and the molten glass inside the crucible gleams with a patient liquid light that waits for the master's return. The bellows handle feels solid and good in your hands, the rhythm of the stroke a comfort that you sink back into, with a feeling that is almost like coming home, a settling of the self into a familiar and beloved routine. The whole island, you reflect, is built on this alternation between fire and water, between the blazing heat of the furnaces and the cool stillness of the canals that surround them. The glassmakers of Murano have lived with this duality for centuries, spending their days and nights in the hot embrace of the furnaces, and then stepping out into the salt air of the lagoon to cool their faces and rest their eyes on the flat grey expanse of the water. The island itself is a small patch of land in the middle of a great wetland, a place where the elements of earth and fire and water meet in a constant negotiation, and the people who live here have learned to move between these elements with a grace that comes from long practice. You are a part of that tradition now, a link in a chain that stretches back to the first glassmakers who settled on Murano after the furnaces were banished from Venice to prevent the risk of fire, and the thought connects you to something larger than your own small self, something that will continue long after your shift has ended and the dawn has come. The master steps back to the furnace, a fresh blowpipe in his hand, and his shadow falls across the glory hole as he positions himself for the next gather. The brief pause is over, the work resumes, and you feel the familiar coordination of your rhythm with his re-establishing itself without the need for words or gestures. The bellows continue their steady cycle. The fire continues to burn, the glass continues to wait in its crucible, and the world outside the window continues its slow progress toward dawn. The lantern on the canal still bobs at the edge of your awareness, a tiny point of light that you can no longer see but that you know is there, a distant companion keeping watch over the sleeping water while you keep watch over the glowing furnace, and the long, quiet remainder of the night stretches out ahead of you like a calm sea under a clouded sky. The night has entered its deepest portion, that stretch of hours when the body begins to feel a pleasant heaviness that is not quite fatigue and not quite sleepiness, but something between the two, a gentle weight that settles into the bones and makes the limbs move with a slower, more deliberate grace. Your arms continue to lift and press the bellows handle, and your shoulders continue to roll forward and back, but the motions have taken on a quality that is almost dreamlike, as if you were performing them underwater or in a thick golden medium that resists quick movement and rewards patience. The bellows themselves seem to share this mood, their leather chambers opening and closing with a softness that might be real or might be your perception altered by the long hours of repetition, the whoosh of the downstroke, longer and more drawn out, the creak of the upstroke deeper and more resonant. The glory hole at the center of the furnace wall has become a soft blur of color that your eyes rest upon without focusing, the sharp edges of the circular opening having long since dissolved into a gentle halo of orange and amber and pale yellow that seems to float in the darkness rather than to be framed by brick. Your eyelids have lowered by a fraction, Not enough to close and not enough to interfere with the work, but enough to filter the light through a thin screen of lashes that turns the already soft glow into something even softer, a diffuse radiance that spills across your field of vision like warm water spreading across a flat stone. You are not sleepy in the sense of wanting to lie down and close your eyes, because the rhythm of the bellows holds you upright and keeps your body engaged. But you are also not fully awake in the way that the morning requires, with its sharp attentions and its quick decisions. You've entered a middle state, a borderland between waking and resting that the night shift creates and sustains for hours at a stretch. This state is not unpleasant, far from it, and you have come to recognize it as one of the gifts that the long hours of labor offer in exchange for the effort they demand. The conscious mind, which during the day is always busy sorting and planning and worrying, has at last fallen quiet. Its voice is reduced to a distant murmur that you can barely hear above the deeper sounds of the furnace and the bellows and your own slow breathing. What remains is a simpler kind of awareness, a presence that observes without judging, that feels without reacting, that simply exists in the warm dark room with the same quiet steadiness as the fire exists in its brick chamber, or the glass exists in its crucible. You are not thinking about the past or the future, not remembering the morning that has already gone, or anticipating the dawn that will eventually arrive. You are entirely inside the present moment, inside the pull and the push, the glow and the warmth, the sound and the silence, and the present moment turns out to be a surprisingly spacious place in which to dwell. The master works on at his bench, his movements slower now than they were at the beginning of the shift, the inevitable effect of the long hours weighing on him just as they weigh on you. He still gathers the glass with the same careful precision, still rolls it on the marva with the same steady rhythm, still blows and shapes and reheats with the same patient attention that he brought to the first goblet of the night, but there is a softness to his pace now, a willingness to take an extra moment between steps, to hold the blowpipe in the glory hole, for a slightly longer reheat, to pause at the water bucket and drink a slow mouthful before returning to the furnace. He does not rush because there is no need to rush. The quota for the night having been set by long tradition rather than by urgent demand, the goblets waiting patiently in the annealing oven with all the time in the world to cool. The master has worked this shift for more years than you have been alive, and he knows how to pace himself through the long dark hours, knows when to push forward and when to ease back. And the deep night is the time for easing back, for conserving energy, for letting the body find its own sustainable rhythm. You notice these small changes in the master's pace without remarking on them, your observations drifting across your awareness like the tiny flecks of ash that occasionally lift from the firebox and float upward through the glory hole before winking out. The ash is finer now than it was earlier in the shift because the fire has burned down to a deep bed of embers that produce almost no smoke, a bed of glowing coals that sits in the base of the firebox and radiates a steady, intense heat without the lively flames that characterize the earlier hours. The embers are a deep red in the center and a powdery gray on the surface, and when the bellows send a fresh stream of air through the tuyere, they brighten from within, a wave of orange that travels across the coal bed and fades again as the oxygen is consumed. The fire does not need to be as fierce now because the glass in the crucible has been at working temperature for many hours and requires only maintenance heat, rather than the intense driving heat that was needed to bring it to liquid state at the start of the evening. The fuel consumption has slowed accordingly, the wood supply that you replenished earlier in the shift still adequate for the hours that remain, the older logs waiting in their neat stack by the workshop door. The smells inside the workshop have intensified and mingled during the long hours until they form a single complex scent that you no longer notice unless you deliberately draw your attention to it. The way a fisherman no longer notices the smell of fish on his own hands. The hot iron of the tools and the blowpipes releases a dry metallic tang that hovers near the marva table, a smell like a blacksmith's shop but fainter, more refined. The olive oil that lubricates the wooden paddles and blocks contributes a soft, nutty sweetness that rises when the master presses the oiled wood against the hot glass, and a tiny wisp of fragrant smoke escapes. The older wood in the firebox adds its own distinct note, a clean and slightly spicy scent that is entirely different from the heavy, resinous smell of pine or the acrid bite of oak. a scent that the glassmakers of Murano prize because it produces a long, steady heat without excessive smoke. And beneath all of these is the permanent background smell of hot brick, a dry and mineral odor that is the smell of the furnace itself. The smell of clay that has been baked and rebaked for years until it has released every last trace of moisture and become a kind of fired pottery in its own right. The wooden bearings of the bellows, which you oiled at the beginning of the shift with a few drops of olive oil from the small clay bottle that hangs on a string near the frame, have been working smoothly all night. But now, in the deep stillness of the late hours, you become aware of a very faint new smell rising from them, the smell of warm oil and slightly heated wood. A clean and almost pleasant scent that indicates the bearings are functioning properly and not binding or wearing. The leather gussets of the bellows also give off their own subtle odor, a rich animal scent that is not unpleasant, the smell of well-cared-for hide that has been oiled and flexed and oiled again for many years. These smells rise and fall with the movement of the bellows, reaching your nose on the upstroke when the leather expands and the air inside the chambers is pushed outward through the seams, and they add another layer to the dense and layered atmosphere of the workshop, an atmosphere that you breathe in and out with each cycle of the handle. Your body, which earlier in the shift communicated its small complaints and adjustments, has now fallen almost entirely silent, the muscles having warmed to their task and the joints having loosened to their full range of motion. The slight ache in your right shoulder that was present during the first few hours has faded away, replaced by a generalized warmth that spreads down your arm and across your upper back, a feeling of blood flowing freely through vessels that have opened to accommodate the steady demand of the work. The palms of your hands, which are protected by the calluses that have formed over many weeks, feel the pressure of the wooden handle as a comfortable solidity rather than as a friction, a point of contact that grounds you in the physical world while your mind drifts in its own quiet spaces. Your knees are slightly bent, your weight is evenly distributed, and your breathing is deep and regular, a pattern that could sustain itself for many more hours without causing you any distress. The sensations of your own body and the sensations of the workshop have begun to blend together in a way that is difficult to describe, a merging of the inner and the outer that happens only during these deep nocturnal hours, when the boundaries between self and world become porous and indistinct. The warmth of your muscles and the warmth of the furnace bricks feel like aspects of the same warmth, a single field of heat that encompasses your body and the fire and the glass and the master and the dark room all together. The rhythm of the bellows and the rhythm of your breath and the rhythm of your heartbeat have synchronized into one continuous pulse that seems to drive the entire workshop. The handle going up as you inhale, the handle going down as you exhale, the fire brightening as the air arrives, the glass softening as the heat increases. You are not separate from the work. You are the work, an integral component of the long process by which sand and ash and fire are transformed into vessels of translucent beauty. And this dissolution of the ego into the task is not a loss of self, but a liberation from the usual confines of being a single, isolated person with a single, limited life. The master pauses in his shaping to add a small amount of crushed colorant to a gather, a pinch of deep blue powder that he takes from a clay pot on the shelf and sprinkles onto the marva before rolling the hot glass through it. The powder melts instantly upon contact with the glass, spreading across the surface in thin, swirling veins of cobalt that the master will work into the body of the vessel with repeated reheatings and rollings. The blue glass, when it takes shape in the glory hole's light, is a color so deep and pure that it seems to be made of the night sky itself, a concentrated indigo that darkens toward black at the edges and brightens toward a luminous sapphire where the light shines through. You watch the colors spread and blend with a quiet appreciation that does not quite rise to the level of thought, a simple visual pleasure that adds a small brightening to the deep contentment of the hour, a feeling that the world contains beautiful things and that you are fortunate to witness them. The deep night continues, its minutes indistinguishable from one another, its darkness unbroken by any sign of approaching dawn. The lantern on the canal, which you glimpsed through the window earlier in the shift, may still be bobbing out there on the black water, or it may have burned out and gone dark, its oil consumed and its wick collapsed into ash. You have no way of knowing and no particular need to know. The seagulls are still asleep on the rooftops. The fishermen are still asleep in their beds. The whole lagoon is still wrapped in the thick blanket of the night, and the only active point of light in the entire world seems to be the glory hole that glows before your eyes. A steady orange sun that burns for you and the master and the glass alone. The thought of the sleeping world outside, the thousands of people lying still in the darkness, their breathing slow and their dreams drifting, adds a final layer of peace to the hour, a sense that you are not alone in your wakefulness, but a part of a larger pattern of rest and watchfulness that covers the islands and the water and the sky. The master finishes the blue goblet and sets it in the annealing oven with the others, closing the iron door on its fading glow, and then he returns to his stool by the water bucket and settles himself for another pause. He drinks from his wooden cup, the water glinting briefly in the furnace light as he tilts his head back, and then he wipes his mouth with the back of his hand and stares into the glory hole with the same peaceful, unfocused gaze that you have been directing there for hours. The two of you are alone together in the warm, dark room, not speaking, not needing to speak, companioned by the fire and the bellows and the quiet certainty that the work will continue until the dawn, and that the dawn will come in its own time, and that until then there is nothing to do but remain exactly where you are, doing exactly what you are doing, the bellows handle moving up and down under your hands with the slow, patient rhythm of a sleeping heartbeat. The first grey light of the approaching dawn arrives so gradually that you do not notice its beginning, only its slow accumulation over many minutes, until the darkness near the high window has softened from a deep, absolute black to a muted charcoal that holds the faintest suggestion of shape within it. The window slit, which all night has been a rectangle of nothing, now shows the dim outlines of the wooden frame that holds the glass, the vertical mullion appearing as a darker line against a slightly less dark background, and the glass itself catching a hint of the outside world. A pale grey wash that is not yet light enough to call illumination, but that is no longer the total absence that filled the earlier hours. The change happens with the patience of water wearing down stone, the daylight advancing across the lagoon from the east, in increments so small that the eye cannot perceive them one by one. And yet, over the course of 100 bellow strokes, the room has undeniably changed, the shadows receding into the corners as if retreating from a slow invader. The glory hole, which all night has been the brightest point in the workshop by an overwhelming margin, now has a competitor for the attention of your eyes. The dusky radiance seeping through the window is not bright enough to outshine the furnace, not nearly so, but it is enough to outline the shapes of the tools and the cooling racks and the water bucket that have been invisible for hours, their forms emerging from the darkness like stones revealed by a falling tide. The blowpipes on the rack appear first as faint vertical lines, then as distinct iron rods with dark wooden mouthpieces and slightly flared tips, each one now distinguishable from its neighbors where before they were a single mass of shadow. The Marva table takes shape as a broad, flat surface supported by heavy wooden legs, its polished iron top reflecting the grey window light in a dull gleam that is entirely different from the warm orange reflections it has been casting all night. The master stool, the water bucket, the stack of older logs by the door, all of these ordinary objects return to visibility with the slow, silent ceremony of the dawn. The master, who has been working at a reduced pace for the past hour, sets the last finished goblet on the Marva and examines it with an unhurried care that speaks of satisfaction rather than urgency. The goblet is a simple drinking vessel of clear glass with a faint greenish tint. The green coming from the iron in the sander was used to make the batch, and its bowl catches both the orange glow of the furnace and the grey light from the window simultaneously, holding the two different qualities of illumination in its thin curved walls like a lens that joins night and day. The master turns the pipe once more, inspecting the foot of the goblet to make sure it is flat and even, and then he wraps the vessel in a small square of paper and cuts it free with the heavy shears, catching it in his gloved hand with the same practiced motion he has used all night. He carries this final goblet across the workshop to the annealing oven, his footsteps sounding slightly different now because the packed earth underfoot has become visible and his stride has the confidence of a man who can see where he is going. The iron door of the annealing oven opens and closes with a soft clank, and the last vessel joins its companions on the bed of fine sand, the whole collection of goblets from the night's work resting together in the steady, moderate heat where they will cool slowly over the next day and a half. The master turns from the annealing oven and walks to the water bucket, where he rinses his hands and then splashes a small amount of water on his face. The coolness of it, a pleasant contrast to the dry heat that has been pressing against his skin all night. He dries his face on a cloth that hangs from a hook near the bucket, and then he walks over to the pipe rack and hangs up the last blowpipe. Its tip still faintly warm, but no longer glowing. The rack is now full, all the pipes arranged in their angled slots, and the marva table is clean of glass fragments, and the wooden paddles are resting in their bucket of water, and the iron jacks and calipers are laid out in their proper order on the folded cloth. The workshop is ready for the day shift, everything in its place, everything prepared for the new workers who will arrive after sunrise to stoke the furnace and begin the next batch of glass. The master turns to face you now, his expression calm and his eyes carrying the slight heaviness of a man who has been awake all night but who is satisfied with the work he has done. He gives you a single nod, the same nod he gave you at the beginning of the shift, but this time the nod carries a different meaning. It is not a greeting, but a release, a signal that the night's labor is complete and that you may rest. You nod back, your hands still moving on the bellows handle, because the fire must be tended until the very last moment, and then the master turns away and walks toward the door, his footsteps fading across the earthen floor, and then pausing as he lifts his cloak from its peg and swings it over his shoulders. The heavy wooden door opens with a low groan of old hinges, and a wash of cool, fresh air sweeps into the workshop, smelling of salt water and damp stone, and the first hint of the bread ovens that are being lit in the bakeries across the island. The master steps through the doorway and disappears into the grey morning, and the door swings shut behind him with a soft thud that seems to mark the end of something, a closing of the night's long chapter. You are alone in the workshop now, alone with the furnace and the bellows and the glory hole that has been your companion through the dark hours. The dawn continues to strengthen outside, the grey light at the window shifting toward a paler, milkier tone that suggests the sun has risen above the horizon of the Adriatic and is now climbing behind the thin layer of cloud that covers the sky. The room, which all night was a warm cave of orange light and deep shadow, now appears as an ordinary workshop, its walls streaked with soot, its floor dusty with ash, its tools hanging in their familiar places. A place of work rather than a place of mystery. The transformation is a little sad in its way, the magic of the nighttime furnace retreating before the practical illumination of the day, but you are too tired to feel the sadness deeply, and besides, you know that the night will return and the furnace will glow again, and the workshop will once more become that warm, enclosed world where time moves differently. You complete a final slow cycle of the bellows, the last full upstroke and downstroke of your shift, and you feel the air rush through the tire and the fire brighten one last time under your hands before you release the handle and let it rise on its own to its resting position. The leather gussets sigh softly as they settle, the wooden frame creaks once, and then the bellows fall silent for the first time since you began the shift so many hours ago. The sudden absence of their sound is strange, a gap in the atmosphere of the room that your ears search for and do not find, and for a moment the workshop feels empty in a way that it did not feel when the master left, as if the ceasing of the bellows has removed the heartbeat from the space. You step away from the bellows frame and walk toward the furnace, your legs feeling slightly stiff after the long hours of standing, but your body still warm and loose from the steady rhythm of the work. The fire in the firebox must be banked before you leave, a task that belongs to the last servant of the night shift, and you know exactly how to do it because you have done it many times before. You take the small iron shovel from its hook on the wall and scoop up a measure of fine dry sand from the bucket that sits near the base of the furnace. This sand is kept for exactly this purpose, to smother the fire without extinguishing it completely, and you open the firebox door carefully with the edge of the shovel, feeling the intense heat wash out across your face as the interior of the firebox is exposed. The embers within are a deep, pulsating red, a bed of coals that glows like a living thing, and you spread the sand across them in a thin, even layer, watching as the red glow is reduced to a dull, muted orange that barely shows through the covering. The sand will slow the combustion without stopping it, allowing the fire to survive through the day until the next shift arrives and rakes away the sand to reveal the embers still alive beneath. You close the firebox door and return the shovel to its hook, and then you stand for a moment before the glory hole, looking into that round opening that has held your gaze for so many hours. The glass inside the crucible is still molten, still glowing with that patient amber light, and it will remain molten throughout the day while the day workers carry on the craft. The glory hole seems smaller now in the growing daylight, less a portal to some other world, and more simply an opening in a brick furnace. But you know that when you return tonight, it will once again become the warm center of your attention, the steady beacon that guides you through the long dark shift. You give the glory hole no farewell because you will see it again soon, only a brief quiet look that acknowledges the companionship of the night. You turn away from the furnace and walk across the workshop toward the door, your leather slippers making soft sounds on the packed earth as you go. You stop at the peg where your cloak hangs and you take it down, the fabric cool and slightly damp from the night air that has been seeping through the door, and you swing it over your shoulders and fasten the wooden toggle at the neck. Then you push the heavy door open and step outside into the morning, and the change is so complete that you pause for a moment on the stone threshold to let your senses adjust to the new world you have entered. The air outside is cool and fresh, and carries a dozen scents that the workshop lacked. The salt of the lagoon, the clean mineral smell of wet stone from the canal, the yeasty warmth of baking bread from the bakery on the next street, and the faint green scent of the marsh grasses that grow on the edges of the island. The sky overhead is a pale, milky grey that is bright enough to make your eyes narrow after the dimness of the workshop, and a few seagulls are already circling above the rooftops, their calls sharp and clean in the quiet morning air. The canal beside the path is no longer the flat black mirror that you glimpsed through the window during the night. It is now a sheet of grey-green water that shows the gentle ripples of the tide moving in from the lagoon, and the boats that were invisible in the darkness are now clearly moored along the stone steps, their wooden hulls glistening with dew and their coiled ropes resting in tidy piles on their decks. You step out onto the stones of the alley and feel the coolness of them through the thin soles of your slippers, a sensation that is entirely different from the warm, packed earth of the workshop floor. The stones are worn smooth by countless feet over countless years, and they are slightly damp from the night mist that rolled in off the water, and they feel solid and permanent under your weight. A foundation that has supported the people of Murano since the island was first built. You begin to walk slowly along the alley, retracing the route that brought you to the workshop at the beginning of the shift. But now you are walking in the opposite direction, and the world around you is waking up rather than settling down. The shutters on the houses are beginning to open as you pass, the wooden panels swinging outwards to admit the grey morning light, and you can hear the sounds of people stirring inside. A baby crying, a woman singing softly as she stirs a pot, a man coughing and clearing his throat as he pulls on his boots. The bakery that was dark and silent when you walked past it last night is now brightly lit from within, and the smell of fresh bread is so strong here that you can almost taste it, a warm yeasty richness that makes your stomach stir with a hunger you had not noticed during the long hours at the bellows. The baker's apprentice, a young boy with flour on his apron, nods to you as you pass, and you nod back, a small acknowledgement between two people who have both been awake while the rest of the island slept. You cross the small bridge near the shrine with the weathered wooden Madonna, and from the top of the bridge you can see out across the canal toward the broader lagoon, where the water stretches away to the east in a flat expanse of pale grey that meets the sky at a horizon so faint it is barely there. A few fishing boats are already heading out toward the open water, their oars dipping with a slow, steady rhythm, their lanterns still burning at the sterns even though the daylight has made them unnecessary. The fishermen call out to one another across the water, their voices carrying clearly in the still air, and the sound is a cheerful one, full of the energy of a new day. You pause on the bridge for a moment to watch them go, and then you continue on your way, your feet finding the familiar path through the alleys toward the small room where you sleep during the daylight hours. The door to your lodging is unlocked, as it always is, and you push it open and step inside the small, quiet space that contains your bed and your chest of belongings and the tiny window that looks out onto a narrow courtyard where a single fig tree grows out of a crack in the stones. You remove your cloak and hang it on the peg by the door, and then you sit on the edge of your bed and pull off your leather slippers, setting them side by side on the floor where they will be ready for you when the evening comes and the shift begins again. The bed is a simple wooden frame with a straw mattress and a wool blanket, and it feels almost impossibly soft as you lie down and stretch out your legs, letting the full weight of your tired body sink into the straw. The pillow is cool against your cheek, and the blanket, when you pull it up to your chin, is warm, but not too warm. A comfortable weight that presses gently down on you. You close your eyes, and behind your lids, you can still see the glory hole, its warm orange glow imprinted on your vision like the afterimage of a candle flame. A small sun that continues to shine in your memory even though you have left the workshop behind. The sound of the bellows is still there too, a faint echo of the whoosh and creak that has filled your ears for so many hours, and you can feel the ghost of the handle in your palms, the smooth wood pressing against your calluses with each remembered stroke. These sensations will fade as you sleep, dissolving into the deep rest that your body needs, and when you wake in the evening, they will have vanished entirely, leaving you fresh and ready for the next shift. But for now, in the quiet moments before sleep takes you, the memory of the furnace is a pleasant companion, a warm presence that lingers at the edge of your awareness, like a friend who has walked you home in the dark and now waits until you are safely inside before turning away. The seagulls call outside your window, their cries growing fainter as they wheel away toward the lagoon, and the sounds of the waking island continue to drift through the walls, the distant tap of a hammer, the splash of an oar, the murmur of voices. But these sounds do not keep you awake, because your body knows the routine so well, knows that the morning is for sleeping and the night is for working, and it settles into the straw mattress with a deep, instinctive trust that the rest will come. The warmth of the blanket wraps around you like the warmth of the furnace, and your breathing slows and your thoughts grow still. And the last thing you are aware of before sleep claims you is the image of the glory hole glowing steadily in the darkness, that small circle of orange light that will be waiting for you when you return, patient and constant, a sun that never sets over the island of Murano.